Oh, hello. Hey, welcome to History Chats this afternoon. Maybe. Yeah, okay. Hey, welcome to History Chats. Okay, making sure that works. Great, it works. Sorry, I'm a little late. Some last minute changes here. But it looks like the stream is working and the PowerPoint and everything are working, so great. Yeah, welcome to History Chats. We're gonna get started in just a minute here. Yeah. So today we are wrapping up our month-long discussion about the villages, some of the villages in Marathon County, with a look at Spencer, which is in some ways very similar to the stories that we've been talking about over the last month, and in some ways a very interesting and different story as well, as they always are. While we're waiting, just to give you a quick plug, this very weekend, if you're watching this the day it comes out or the next day or two, we're going to actually have the opportunity to host Michael Gock, who's an author of a great author, and he wrote a book about the Badger Army Ammunition Plant. And so he's going to be here at the Historical Society here in Wausau, the Woodson History Center, this weekend, Saturday, August 27th. So it'll be at 2 p.m. I will hopefully be live streaming or recording if we can't get the internet to cooperate, but this is a live event. So if you're looking for something to do this Saturday and you want to learn about a curious little bit of Wisconsin history, it's a great opportunity. So, okay, with that out of the way, hey. All right. So we're going to talk about Spencer today. Interesting story. So as I said, we have been talking about villages. These communities that have grown to the size to the point where they want to incorporate and are recognized by the government as being, not just in an unincorporated area, but they're villages. But they're still, have their own little character, and they're not cities. They're not quite as large enough to warrant becoming a city. Although that's always a discussion and changes over the years for sure. But Spencer is an interesting story. Like I said, Spencer is a story that is, in one hand, very unique in some ways, and then also very similar in the sense that, Spencer, like many of the communities in this region, they get their start with the railroad. And for this, we need to kind of step back and talk about I apologize if you're not a railroad person. I'm going to try to make it as interesting as possible. But really, the genesis of Spencer, as well as many of the other communities, particularly the western part of Marathon County, are born out of the railroad. So let's talk about that. So this is Wisconsin back in the 1850s. I mean, they don't even have, Marathon County is here technically. It's this bit in the center, but they don't. They don't really have, Wausau or Mosinee. There's Stevens Point down here, spelled Stephens Point. Yeah, but there's no roads really. There's some dirt roads. There's some paths. There's some railroads that would have been further south back in the 1850s. But there's not a whole lot. But the railroads we do want to get railroads up here, and particularly by the 1860s, in the course of the American Civil War, the government recognizes there's a real limitation here in Wisconsin, in that the most of the waterways and the roads that we have, take this off, have in the state go east-west. You can get out Green Bay and you can follow some roads and, the Fox River over to the Wisconsin and then take that down to the Mississippi. And yeah, there's some roads in the communities that are emerging down in the south. But if you want to get up here, particularly if you want to get up to the Iron Range, the resources way up in northern Wisconsin, that's tough to do. And in the important years of the war, during the Civil War, they really need to get men and materials in and out of that area. But, going all the way along on boats through Lake Superior and then getting down into Michigan, it's not an easy way to do that. And so in 1864, the government establishes, basically sets aside land and money to encourage a railroad company to build the land. Basically, they fund the creation of a railroad that would take, ends up connecting Ashland down to Menasha. Now, Menasha is kind of near, Appleton, in that area. It's actually kind of maybe not the community that we think of as the thing there in this region, but it is kind of important, particularly for the railroads that are emerging. It's one of those transportation hubs. And ultimately, there is going to be a company that gets formed. It's going to take a few years. Also another quick note. Here in Marathon County, our representative, Walter McIndoe, who lives in Wausau, he wants to make sure that Marathon County isn't, that this potential railroad that goes through here is not going to go around Marathon County. So he puts it in there that says that this railroad, if you're going to get funding from the state and from the federal government, you need to go through Marathon County. And that'll come into play in a bit. As I said, it takes a few years. That's 1864. By the end of the 1860s, we start to see a development of a railway. This is going to be the Wisconsin Central. Now, they're going to do this in chunks. So the first leg of the construction of this railway goes from Menasha over to Stevens Point, which makes sense. It's already kind of a hub of roads and networks of trading. And along this route, you can very easily connect to existing communities. There's not a lot of them necessarily, and they're not huge, but at least you can kind of grow. And so they get to Stevens Point and they say, hey, Stevens Point, Portage County, would you like to have the railroad coming here? I'm sure you do. You should give us some money and some land so that we can build the railway. And that's what they end up doing. From here, there's not, I mean, looking up here, even this is a decade old, give or take, about 5-6 years behind what we're looking. No, I'm sorry, 1870s. It gets to Stevens Point in 1871-72. So this map is very outdated for the purposes, but bear with me. Wausau, Mosinee are over here. There's Neilsville over here, but there's not a lot, especially if you want to get to Ashland. So that tactic of going to a community and saying, hey, you should give me money, the company money, so we can build the railway. Well, they do that to Wausau, right? And so, but after that, it's going to get kind of tough. Except they don't go to Wausau. The Wisconsin Central has a contract with Marathon County to do this, but some folks here, particularly Judge Silverthorne and some of the farmers up in the Germans that are settling up in the town of Maine and Berlin, they don't really see the value in the county going to debt so they can get a fancy railway. Like, why would we need that? And so what they end up doing is they kind of stall out the ability to raise the money, and eventually this contract disappears, and the railway disappears. It doesn't come up to Wausau, but instead they make the decision to go westward. So they do, and you can see here just a little bit. They go right through the southwest, about 5-6 miles they cut through. And then they go up the county line all the way, and they barely touch. I don't know if this was a point of the railroad company being vindictive and saying, well, if you don't want to pay us, fine. We're just going to, fulfill the obligations to McIndoe's addition to the funding, and then we're just going to, not do that. Or maybe the land was cheaper. I'm not really sure what the deal was, but this is what ends up happening. And actually, this is the actual, you can highlighted the route, so you can see where it goes. Now, there's a bunch of communities that come into being. Like, there is no Marshfield until the railway goes through. Not really. There's not really a Colby or a Medford or Spencer. Spencer is going to be one of these communities that pop up in the aftermath of the railroad coming through, because as the railway comes through, suddenly there's access to land. In other words, there's not a great river network. There's not a great road running through that area yet. So with the railway, suddenly homesteaders looking for land, suddenly this becomes very attractive land to settle on. And the lumber companies move in and they get going, cutting trees down, because suddenly they have the ability to pull out that resource that they previously didn't have. And it's interesting because you see so many of these. I mean, this is just from Hewitt, Marshfield, Mansville, Spencer, Romeo, Unity, Colby, Abbotsford, Dorchester, Stettonville, and Medford. There's a lot of communities. And granted, some of those, we don't really talk about Mansville or Romeo very much these days. But a lot of these remain important to these areas. These are communities, villages, and cities, which is pretty remarkable. And the density along the route is not really something we see in other places, but B, it's also a product of the reality of running the railway. Because see, the steam engines they were using, the locomotion that powered the trains, well, they needed to be able to stop and refuel in water every couple, like 10 to 15 miles. So typically we will see, and that one of the reasons that Spencer and Unity and Colby and Abbotsford, like they come into being. Some of them, there might be some people that are already there. Some of them are just literally, we need a stop for the railroad. And then the community starts to go around that. And from what I can tell, Spencer is one of the latter. And so as an important stop on the railway, they end up becoming kind of an important place. And as I said, lumbering starts up pretty quickly after that. There's a lot of trees, pine. I will say, actually, before I move on, one of the other reasons that may have justified this movement is the pinery, the forest of central Wisconsin. Like, I can't find a reasonable explanation of how forested this part of the county was compared to this. It might have been easier from a geographic perspective and the logistics to go around that way. It might be possible. I don't actually know. Yeah, kind of interesting to see that happen though. It's also not the county line here, between Clark County and Marathon County, or going up, like that's an arbitrary line based off of a meridian. It's just 6 miles west of an important place. So this isn't like this is a natural place where there's a river or like that's so I don't know. It's interesting. I wish I knew more. Maybe at some point we'll follow up and we'll talk again about these communities, hopefully with more information. Anyway. With the emergence of the railway, suddenly you can get access to these trees that you previously, people wanted them, but, you don't really have a way to get them out. But now that the railway is here, now, lumbering starts in earnest. This is one of the later mills from the 1850s. I grabbed this from the book. Oh, yeah. I should mention from sourcing point of view, cool, this isn't backwards. This is a centennial that was put out in 1974 for the village of Spencer. There's also a great resource that was put out a year or two later, I think, about the town of Spencer around the village itself. Both of which have some great pictures that I borrowed for this purpose, since we don't have quite as extensive, or it was just easier just to scan the book. But this is one of the pictures from that, which is why it's kind of pixel, or, anyway. Yeah, so lumbering happens. Now, before too long, certainly by the 1880s, the AZ lumber kind of goes away. The lumber mills that get set up aren't necessarily like it's let's put it this way, it's not like some of the other earlier lumbering communities that continue to exist for decades. Instead, you start to see, the clearing of the area, and then, I mean, there are lumber companies that continue well into the 20th century here. I don't want to say that that's not the case, but very quickly you start to see the arrival, relative to some, like, say, Wausau's history, where we were lumbering for like 20 years before we start to see lots of farms. Almost immediately after the railroad shows up, we start to see homesteads, and that ends up becoming, an important thing here, and a community emerges. And I will say, okay, so this is the original Irene plat, right? Lamb's edition added in 1900. So there's additions here. This is from the Marathon County plat map from 1900 or 1901. Sorry. Irene was originally one of the names for this community. It was also, I believe, so originally when the spot was established, it was called Section 40, apparently, which I think has to do with the section of the railway. And then it became known, Waltham was sort of the area around the depot. There was one of the early lumbermen came here, and he decided I'm guessing he platted out this area, and he named it after his wife, Irene. And so the community was known as Irene for a year or two, and then by the mid 1870s, late 1870s, I think 77 or something like that, the name Spencer became attached to it. This wasn't a village. This is just a community at this point. They didn't incorporate, but there's a fairly, robust population that emerges here between the lumbering operations, between the early farmers that are setting up in the region. Yeah. The name Spencer, I believe, comes from, oh crap, I'm not going to remember the name of the town. There's a Spencer out east someplace, like on the East Coast, which is fairly common for names to get recycled in that manner. Anyway, the community emerges, right? So let's talk about the community. Over the years, there's been a lot. I should say, actually, before I get there, I wanted to show this. So this is the depot area. The railroad continues to be really important to the area. You can't understate that at all. One of the things that they did, and actually I should have put, let me go back to this. So one of the things that they were doing back here, interestingly, that connection point where they were originally trying to get from Menasha up to Ashland, that takes to 1886, I believe, is when they finally complete the line. And while they're doing that in the early 1880s, they start to, like this jut here going west to the Twin Cities gets added, and they extend the other side so they have connections down to Chicago. And one of the problems that they realized is while Abbotsford is a nice switching point, it's not the most efficient because people wanting to go from like Chicago up to the Twin Cities would have to go all the way up here and then go west. And so around the turn of the century, around 1900, I want to say 1900, 1903, somewhere in there, Spencer actually becomes, let me go back here. So you can see 1900, there's the one, the rail goes into town and then it goes up. But if we look at this picture here, you can see that there are actually two tracks. There's the one going north that's going over here, right? Actually, I found out that there is oh, that's not it. There is a pointer, laser pointer. I don't know if this is better. There's a northern route here. And then there's actually a western route. So Spencer becomes the switching hub going westward to Owen and Withee. And when this happens, around around this period, it becomes even more important to the railroad. So, yeah, lots of traffic coming through here, and that, of course, helps to build the community in a big way. As I said, communities emerge, a bunch of churches show up. This is certainly one of the surprising things that I thought, oh yeah, there's going to be churches that come and go, and there are some congregations and things like that. But usually when you're looking at a book like Spencer, Wisconsin, published in 1974. I would expect that over the subsequent decades, some of these churches might, go away or be consolidated or split off. But as far as I can tell, all 5 of these churches that are shown in here are still, I mean, obviously these buildings are not being used still, but actually not all of them. I think maybe 1 or 2 of them might be. Anyway, I didn't look too deeply into the longer varied history of the churches, but kind of cool to see. Lots of different groups of people coming here. Schools. Schools are very important. I really love this school, which is, I think, in the 1880s, 1890s. There was a big fire that hit Spencer in the early 80s, and then I think there was another school that burned down later in the 1880s. So I think this is the one that kind of sticks into the 20th century. It gets replaced by this one in 1915. We'll talk about that in a second. But just unusual. Is a graded school, so it's not a one-room schoolhouse by any means. It's got a bigger area, but kind of an unusual architecture. Schools are important. Many, especially early in the 20th century, there's a lot of like local schooling that happens in one-room schoolhouses and small schools. Spencer is one of those communities, though, that starts a high school. And, by the 19-teens, having a high school and a larger education than just, elementary school makes it sort of a robust community. Whereas other communities that maybe had a school system, when the one-room school systems get kind of consolidated in the 50s and 60s, the 1950s and 60s, when school buses and stuff like that kind of helped streamline the process. Spencer remains kind of an important hub of education as well, having the high school, having, continuing the elementary school, as well as, some secondary education. I mean, to this day, there's still a I want to say the tech school. Yeah, I think there's an annex of the tech school, or for some classes as well as some other learning. I'm gonna double check that real quick. Um, it's probably gonna take me too long to make it worth the while, but don't want to get that wrong. Yeah, the North Central Technical College. So there's a campus out there. Whew, got it right. Great. Worth it. Also, businesses. Lots of businesses show up. I mean, you'd expect a general store and a blacksmith, and certainly there's a lot of like farming related businesses that show up here, and as well as lumber, kind of relating to those industries as they emerge. Just kind of a cool interior of a general store. Meat market. Again, I grabbed a bunch of these from, this book, some interesting ones. There's a lot of other ones. There was a brewery there for a bit until the 1880s when they moved. There's a brickyard. There were, like I said, lots of different stuff. There's a beauty shop. Kind of a fun picture. Decided to take a quick colorization there. I don't think it's this building. I think it's the previous building that the beauty shop was in. Was actually also a jewelry store. So Guy Ingram and apparently his wife, whose name I'm blanking on at the moment, did a lot of work to this. They ended up closing it in the 20s in part because their fur business took off. Oh, I forgot to put some color there too. Fox fur, interesting little novelty. Here in Marathon County, of course, we have the Fromm brothers up in Hamburg, and they always get a lot of the attention. And certainly they were sort of pioneers, but certainly the Ingrams also got in on this. In fact, apparently he started kind of experimenting a little bit with some fox ranching, or fur ranching. He started with skunks, actually, which is interesting. But he ended up buying some foxes up from the Fromm brothers around 1912 or so, and then from there became quite successful as in the fox fur business. Gets some mink in the 40s, and of course kind of shares that sort of rise and fall of the industry of the fur farms. But adds an interesting little thing, the Ingrams being kind of a unique part of the community, adding that dimension. Lumbering, of course, is important to this point. I don't remember why I put this at this place. Oh, I remember why. So let's talk about, I think one of the important center points to Spencer today actually has its roots in a lumbering community. So this is from this book, where they talk about the foundation of modern day industry in the village began in 1913 when a corporation named the Spencer Lumber and Supply Company was formed by, I think, Thomas or T.A. Tack and Helen Tack and H.A. Martin. I think some of them were from out of town. I think Martin had some operations here, and the Tacks were originally from, I want to say, Portage County. I will be honest, I was putting in the resources. I went to go find some newspaper articles, and I did find some things. This is an interesting point, though, and I think, unfortunately, I had to put a correction here, a clarification, because they talk about this in this book as being the Lumber and Supply Company. They dealt in lumber and buying and selling in pine and hardwood timberland. And then they operated until 1927 when they changed the name to the Dairy Belt Cheese and Butter Company. And then from there it becomes sort of a cheese factory type deal. And while this is true, this is from 1913. They did get started at the Spencer Lumber and Supply Company did get organized by those people. Tack of Marshfield, I guess, at this point. Formerly of Stevens Point, that's what it was. And then H.A. Martin. However, they also, you can see here, it's a branch of the firm being named the Dairy Belt Cheese Company. So they actually didn't rename the company. I'm sure there's some nuance here that's maybe not translating, but they actually had both the dairy as well as the lumber company. And then they ended up selling, as evidenced by this, in the 20s. They sold the lumber side of things to Connor and Stratford, or I guess of Marshfield here. But they do continue, right? They continue. They buy up. Dairy is definitely an important part of Marathon County, and certainly the dairy belt. This is the dairy belt, right? That's the name of their company. They buy up and I should say there's other cheese operations and cheese factories, and people making butter and dairy products as well. This is one of those, the Spencer Milk Products Company, which gets bought, I think, in the early 30s by the Dairy Belt Cheese and Butter Company. And they continue to run this for many years throughout the 40s and 50s. Interestingly, if you were reading the bit over here, they established cheese assembling warehouses as far as Spencer, Fremont, Thorpe, Boyd, Ashland, Ladysmith, and Cameron. And so they bought up cheese factories, and then later they sold them to the, I think during the Depression years, they sold those to the Wheeler Cheese Company, Green Bay. So there's sort of expansion and constriction as companies do over the years. But ultimately, they continue until in 1963, they sell to Land O'Lakes, which is based in Minnesota. And they have taken over and really kind of invested and made the Spencer factory. I mean, literally, when they talked about the center of industry, if we look at here's Google Earth and Spencer, right in the center of the village of Spencer is this factory, which is the dairy factory of Land O'Lakes. So to this day, still an important part of the community and central, and a big employer there as well. And I should say, farming and other industries are still very much alive and well. The population, I was going to make a slide for this, but I did forget. The population from like 1940 here in Spencer was something like 500, a little over 500 people. And within 20, 30 years, that had it doubled again to nearly 2,000, which is roughly where they are to this day. I think the 2020 census estimated something about 1,800 people, maybe give or take a little bit there. So it's still a pretty robust community, especially compared to the smaller villages that we've looked at. Not to say that we're comparing or anything, but if we are comparing, it is one of the larger villages, certainly in the rural area. Particularly in quite a feat for that community because of the fact that it is such a close proximity to larger centers as well. I mean, the fact that Spencer and Colby and Unity and Marshfield can all kind of exist within that close proximity. Stratford's there, right? Kind of cool to see. So that remains that integrity. And again, part of this is the fact of the infrastructure. Excuse me. In the 1920s, this becomes a crossroads not only for the railway that comes through, but also some county and state highway traffic as well. So if you're going through that area, Highway 13 and Highway 98, I think these came in let's just say early 1920s, I believe, is when they really get developed for car travel. So yeah, still kind of definitely an interesting community. I hope you learned a little bit about it. Hopefully I didn't get, too much wrong here. I'm sure I just, there's some nuance there, of course. Anyway, yeah, like I said, this has been a fun topic this month to talk about the history of villages. Just like last month when we were talking about unincorporated communities, try that again, unincorporated communities. Because we get a chance to talk about and for Gary and I, we got a chance to look at some of these villages and communities that I've been to Spencer a few times. I know a little bit about the history going some bits and pieces, but it's always a great opportunity to delve in and learn more and put together a program. And next time you're in the area, if you're traveling through Spencer, maybe you'll know a little bit more about its history. So yeah. Like I said, we're wrapping up this month. We're talking about villages. This actually is going to bring us into September next week somehow. September marks actually, so we started doing history chats back in September of 2020. So we will have, basically we will hit our 2-year anniversary in the next month. Wrapping up the last month of our second year. We'll also hit 100 episodes, which is kind of interesting. So because it's a bit of a milestone, we're kind of getting to that point. We decided to pick an interesting topic of some interesting lasts in Marathon County history. So, last time the passenger trains came through, speaking of, fur, we're going to talk a little bit about the last Fram fur auction back in 1939, and last time the trolleys were active. And of course, next week we're going to be talking specifically about, ooh, whoops, take that away. The last log drive, which is a topic that I've been really excited about to share. I've been digging into this story for a couple, well, months, I guess, off and on. And it all centers around this very intriguing picture and its supposed label of being the last log drive on the Wisconsin River in 1912. So we'll look at that and find out what a last log drive might be, and whether or not this is, where does this picture come into the story. So there we go. Let's see. Let me go and check to see if, I guess I can put up, there's a picture of Spencer. I don't know if there are any questions. I'm just gonna check to make sure. Doesn't look like I'm seeing very much, which is just fine. Cool. Well, I think I'm going to call it there. Thanks so much for watching, if you're still watching, and yeah, we'll see you hopefully in the future. Again, don't forget this weekend, and just in a couple days, we have the Powder People in Place, the story of the Badger Army ammunition plant. That'll be here this Saturday at 2. And yeah, more interesting history to come. Hope to see you next time. Enjoy the rest of your day.